3 emissions, which in most industries is the biggest source of emissions. These are also known as other indirect emissions. Scope 3 emissions do not occur within the company's boundaries, such as its offices or factories, but occur in the upstream and downstream value chain. This includes any emissions generated from activities happening in the value chain, from procuring raw materials to the disposal of products after their life ends. Let's take an example. If a company purchases toilet paper for its office bathrooms, the emissions generated while producing the toilet paper by another company would be accounted for under Scope 3 emissions. There are 15 categories under which Scope 3 emissions accounting takes place. Let's take an example of Company X to understand each of these categories briefly. Purchased goods and services. Emissions from any goods and services produced outside the company but used by Company X in its day-to-day operations will be accounted for in Category 1 of Scope 3 emissions of Company X. Capital goods. Emissions from producing machinery and other capital. Goods by their manufacturer would be accounted for under Category 2 of Scope 3. Emissions if capital goods are used by Company X. Fuel and energy-related activities. Emissions from activities related to fuel and energy production outside the company, but used by Company X would be accounted for under Category 3 of Scope 3 emissions if the fuel is used by Company X. Travel-related emissions. Any emissions generated by trains, cars, or airplanes used by Company X's employees for business purposes would be accounted for under Category 6 of Scope 3 emissions. Similarly, any emissions generated while Company X's employees commute to and from work, including emissions generated while working from home, would be accounted for under Category 7 of Scope 3 emissions. Transportation and distribution related. Emissions from the transportation and distribution using modes not owned by Company X, such as trains, airplanes, and ships not owned by the company, but used for transporting goods into Company X's facility, would be accounted for under Category 4 of Scope 3 emissions. Similarly, emissions from transporting and distributing goods from the company to its customers would be accounted for under Category 9 of Scope 3 emissions. Product-related emissions. This includes emissions under 4 different categories of Scope 3, namely Category 5, 10, 11, and 12. During the manufacturing process, the company may generate waste, and the disposal of this waste, whether through landfill, recycling, or other means, results in certain emissions. These emissions would be accounted for under Category 5 of Scope 3 emissions for Company X. At times, goods produced by the company are input for another company and are processed further. In such cases, emissions generated by another company in further processing would be accounted for under Category 10 of Scope 3 emissions of Company X. When goods are sold for customer use, let's say Company X sold diesel cars to its customers. Emissions generated by consumers while using the cars and burning fuel are accounted for under Category 11 of Scope 3, emissions of Company X. Lastly, when goods reach their end of life, let's take the example of diesel cars sold by Company X, the car would either be disposed of as scrap, and emissions generated during the disposal would be accounted for under Category 12 of Scope 3 emissions for Company X. Leased assets. At times, Company X takes or gives assets on lease as part of its business. In such cases, the emissions from leased assets are accounted for under Category 8 or 13 of Scope 3 emissions, depending on the lease agreement. Franchises. If Company X has various franchises to carry out its business, the emissions generated by those franchises are accounted for under Category 14 of Scope 3 emissions. Investment emissions. If Company X invests its money through equity or debt, the emissions generated by the investee using that money would be accounted for as emissions of Company X under Category 15 of Scope 3 emissions.